Case 1. Janine and Jones. In the pediatric intensive care unit at Bexar County Hospital in San Antonio, Texas, infants and toddlers were going into cardiac arrest at a rate that alarmed even the most experienced physicians on staff. Children who had been stable, some recovering from minor issues, were suddenly crashing. And something else stood out. The emergencies were not spread evenly across the clock. They were concentrated. They kept happening on one specific shift, the 3 to 11 p.m. shift. The shift worked by a licensed vocational nurse named Janine Jones. Jones had been working in the pediatric ICU since the early 1980s. She was known among colleagues as energetic, attentive, someone who seemed to thrive in high-pressure situations. But behind that reputation, investigators would later learn, something deeply troubling had been unfolding for months. When hospital administrators quietly asked the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention to review the unit's patient data, the results were extraordinary. The analysis showed that children were more than 25 times more likely to suffer a medical emergency while in Jones's care. They were more than 10 times more likely to die. The hospital did not report her to authorities. Instead, they let her go quietly and gave her a positive professional reference. Jones moved on. She left San Antonio and went to work at a small pediatric clinic in Kerrville, Texas, a rural community about 60 miles away. The clinic was run by a young physician who had no idea what had been happening in San Antonio. In September of 1982, a 15-month-old girl named Chelsea McClellan was brought to the clinic for a routine wellness visit. She was healthy, happy, and had no serious medical history. After receiving injections from Jones, Chelsea went into sudden cardiac arrest. She was rushed to a hospital but could not be saved. She died that same day. Chelsea's mother, Petty McClellan-Weiss, told investigators what she witnessed immediately after the injection, and her account would become one of the most important pieces of testimony in the entire case. What she described pointed directly at Jones. Texas Rangers were brought in. The clinic was searched. Investigators found missing vials of succinylcholine, a powerful paralytic medication that had no legitimate reason to be at a small pediatric clinic. Medical examiners looked at Chelsea's tissue and found traces of the drug. Investigators then went back to San Antonio. They began reviewing every case from Jones's time in the pediatric ICU. They found patterns consistent with heparin, a blood thinner, and the anticonvulsant Dilantin appearing in children who should never have received them. At least one infant, a 4-week-old boy named Rolando Santos, had nearly died in Jones's care under suspicious circumstances. Janine Jones was arrested in May of 1983. At trial in February of 1984, a jury in Williamson County convicted her of murdering Chelsea McClellan. She was sentenced to 99 years in prison. A second conviction followed for her role in injuring infant Rolando Santos. That sentence was 60 years. But the story did not end there. In Texas at the time, a prison overcrowding law from 1977 meant that Jones was on track for mandatory release decades before her sentences expired. When her release became possible in 2017, families who had lost children in San Antonio went public. Bexar County prosecutors reopened the investigation. Jones was indicted on 5 additional murder counts related to her time at the San Antonio hospital. In January of 2020, rather than face another trial, Jones pleaded guilty to the 1981 murder of 11-month-old Joshua Sawyer. She was sentenced to life in prison. Investigators have stated that Jones is suspected of harming or killing as many as 40 or more children over the course of her career. Only 2 murders have resulted in formal convictions. The others remain unresolved. Janine Jones is currently held in a Texas state prison. She will not be eligible for parole until 2037, when she would be in her mid-80s. For the families who lost children in San Antonio, families who waited more than 3 decades for answers, the system that was supposed to protect their children failed them twice. Once inside a hospital, and once when that hospital chose silence over accountability. Case 2. Kimberly Clark Signs. 2 patients were sitting in their chairs at a dialysis clinic in Lufkin, Texas, watching a nurse they had seen dozens of times before. What they witnessed on the morning of April 28, 2008, would eventually send that nurse to prison for the rest of her life. The nurse was Kimberly Clark Sines, a licensed vocational nurse in her mid-30s who had been working at the DaVita Dialysis Center in Lufkin, located in Angelina County in East Texas. Dialysis patients are among the most medically vulnerable people in any healthcare setting. They depend on a machine to filter their blood, a process that takes hours, performed multiple times a week. They are connected to lines and equipment they trust completely. The two patients, Linda Hall and Lurleen Hamilton, watched as Sines drew something into a syringe from a container near the cleaning station. They watched her walk to another patient's chair. They watched her inject the contents of that syringe into that patient's dialysis line. Both women reported what they saw to staff. They had just witnessed something that investigators would later confirm. Sines had been drawing bleach, used to clean equipment at the clinic, into syringes and introducing it directly into the bloodstreams of patients during treatment. By the time investigators arrived, 5 patients had died. 5 others had been seriously injured. All of the deaths and injuries occurred in April of 2008. All of them fell within the same narrow window, the period when Sines was on shift. The investigation that followed moved quickly. Lufkin's fire department had already flagged the clinic to state inspectors weeks earlier, noting an unusual surge in emergency calls originating from the same address. When clinical staff confronted Sines after Hall and Hamilton came forward, a bucket and syringes near the area where Sines had been working tested positive for bleach. Then investigators looked at Sines's home computer. On April 1, 2008, the same day the first 2 patients died, Sines had searched the internet for information about bleach poisoning. She had also searched whether bleach could be detected in dialysis lines. A forensic chemist developed a specialized test that detected a chemical marker of bleach exposure in the blood of the deceased patients and in the tubing from their dialysis machines. The evidence connected every confirmed adverse event in April 2008 directly to Sines. Before working at DaVita, Sines had been fired from a different Lufkin area hospital under suspicion of stealing medications. At the time she was hired by DaVita, the Texas Board of Nurse Examiners was already reviewing her license. The hiring process had not caught any of it. Kimberly Clark Sines went to trial in Angelina County in the spring of 2012. Over 18 days of testimony, jurors heard from the surviving patients who witnessed what happened, forensic experts, and investigators. On March 30, 2012, the jury found her guilty of capital murder for the death of 1 patient and guilty of aggravated assault for the injuries to 3 others. 2 days later, she was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus 3 additional consecutive terms of 20 years each for the assault convictions. 5 families in Lufkin lost someone they loved during that April. People who had come in for routine treatment. People who had done everything right. The patients who spoke up, the ones sitting in their chairs, watching, willing to say what they saw, are the reason the case was built. Their voices are why this case reached a courtroom at all. Case 3, William George Davis. The hospital had installed new cameras in the cardiovascular ICU in early 2018. It was a routine security measure. No one announced it broadly. No one expected them to record what they did. On January 25, 2018, a patient named Joseph Kalina, who had recently undergone heart surgery and was recovering in the ICU, suddenly and unexpectedly collapsed. His medical team responded immediately, but before they could stabilize him, someone reviewed the new security footage from outside his room. The footage showed a registered nurse named William George Davis entering Kalina's room shortly before the crash. When the emergency response began and the hallway filled with staff, Davis could be seen standing nearby, watching. That image, that moment of stillness while chaos unfolded around him, would become one of the central images of the investigation that followed. Davis had been working as an RN in the cardiovascular intensive care unit at Christus Trinity Mother Francis Lewis and Peaches Owen Hart Hospital in Tyler, in East Texas, since 2013. The unit cared for patients recovering from some of the most serious cardiac procedures in medicine, people in their most fragile state. Hospital administrators launched an internal review after the Kalina incident. What they found was deeply troubling. When they mapped every unexpected patient emergency against staffing records, Davis's name appeared repeatedly. The events were not spread across the unit. They were concentrated around his shifts. Around his assignments, Texas Rangers and law enforcement were called in. Davis was arrested in April of 2018. As investigators built their case, the scope of what happened inside that ICU became clearer. Prosecutors presented evidence that Davis had introduced air into the arterial lines of patients recovering from heart surgery, a deliberate act that caused strokes and, in multiple cases, death. The method left a signature that physicians and forensic experts could identify: air embolism, bubbles in the bloodstream, where no bubbles should ever be. Four patients were identified as murder victims: John Lafferty, Ronald Clark, Christopher Greenaway, and Joseph Kalina. Evidence presented at the punishment phase of trial suggested that 5 additional patients suffered serious brain injuries as a result of Davis's actions, and that 3 more deaths may have been connected to him. Among the most striking pieces of evidence presented at trial, a phone call Davis made from the Smith County Jail to his former wife. In it, he described wanting to keep ICU patients on life support longer, suggesting it benefited him financially through overtime pay. He called the deaths accidents. Investigators also found that Davis had searched an internet list of the world's most prolific killers by victim count in 2018. The trial took place in Smith County in the fall of 2021. Security camera footage placed Davis at the scene of multiple incidents. Medical experts testified that the patient's neurological collapses were inconsistent with any natural cause. On October 19, 2021, the jury found Davis guilty of capital murder on 4 counts. 8 days later, he was sentenced to death. William George Davis is currently held on death row at the Polunsky Unit in Livingston, Texas. The families of the men who came to that hospital for heart surgery, men who made it through their procedures and were beginning to recover, have had to carry the knowledge that the recovery they were promised was taken from them inside that quiet unit, one room at a time. Case 4. Vicki Dawn Jackson. Nocona, Texas, is a small town in Montague County, near the Oklahoma border. It has fewer than 3,000 residents. Its general hospital serves the surrounding community, a place where most people know each other, where the same families have lived for generations. In the final weeks of 2000 and the opening weeks of 2001, 10 patients died at Nocona General Hospital. Most of them had been admitted for minor conditions: a footsore, diarrhea, a heart issue that appeared to be resolving. One of the 10 was an elderly man named E. Jackson, the grandfather of a licensed vocational nurse who worked at the hospital. His name was connected to hers, Vicki Dawn Jackson. When local paramedics noticed the volume of emergency calls coming from Nocona General, they did something that would change everything. They wrote letters, quietly, without announcing it, to state health inspectors. They flagged what they were seeing: too many calls, too many deaths, a pattern that didn't match what they normally expected from a community hospital of that size. Hospital administrators also noticed. They reviewed shift logs. They reviewed pharmacy records. And what they found in the pharmacy records was a significant discrepancy. Vials of a medication called mivacurium, a powerful muscle paralytic, were missing. Mivacurium, also known as Mivacrin, is not a drug that disappears accidentally. It has a narrow, specific purpose in clinical settings, and it requires careful documentation. The investigation moved to law enforcement. On February 20, 2001, Texas Rangers and investigators searched Vicki Dawn Jackson's property. Among the items recovered from her garbage was a syringe. Testing confirmed it was positive for mivacurium. Investigators applied to exhume the bodies of patients who had died during the period under review. 10 bodies were exhumed. Testing confirmed the presence of mivacurium in each of them. There was more. A civil lawsuit filed in 2001 included a statement from a patient who had survived, a 61-year-old man named Donnelly Reed, who had been hospitalized with complications related to a prior illness. Reed stated that Jackson had injected something into his foreline and that he had gone into sudden respiratory distress. He was saved by another nurse who happened to intervene. Reed died of unrelated causes about 2 months later. After Jackson's arrest in July of 2002, her daughter came forward with something significant. Jackson had given her daughter a sealed box and asked her to hold it. After the arrest, the daughter turned it over to investigators. Inside the box were product information pamphlets for Mivacrin, newspaper clippings about the patient deaths, and handwritten notes written by Jackson herself. Jackson spent years fighting the charges. In 2006, facing a potential death sentence and the prospect of her daughter testifying against her at trial, she accepted a plea agreement. On October 5, 2006, Vicki Dawn Jackson pleaded no contest to 10 counts of capital murder. She was sentenced to life in prison. She will not be eligible for parole until 2042. The 10 people who died in Nocona during those winter months had not been critically ill. They had walked into that hospital expecting to recover and go home. The community they came from, small, close-knit, trusting, had no reason to suspect that anything like this could happen in a place so familiar. 10 families in Montague County found out it could. Case 5, Anthony Mambolio Nyakio. The patient was 74 years old. She had end-stage Alzheimer's disease. She was nonverbal. She was completely dependent on the staff at Woodridge Health and Rehabilitation in Grapevine, Texas, for every aspect of her daily care. She could not speak for herself, but the evidence would. On a day in January of 2018, a staff member at Woodridge contacted the charge nurse on duty, a woman named Alyssa Osorio, and told her that something was wrong with the patient. Osorio examined her immediately. What she found was an injury that had no medical explanation, no natural cause, no documented fall, no procedure, no condition that could account for what she was seeing. Osorio later testified that what she observed was something that, in her professional experience, simply did not happen to an elderly woman in a bed, not on its own. A sexual assault nurse examiner was brought in. The exam was completed. DNA was recovered. Investigators worked carefully and methodically. Every male staff member employed at Woodridge at the time was asked to provide a DNA sample voluntarily. All of them complied. The samples were sent to a laboratory for comparison. One sample matched. The match belonged to Anthony Mambolio Nyakio, a certified nursing assistant who had direct access to the patient as part of his regular duties. Nyakio was charged with 2 counts of aggravated sexual assault of an elderly and disabled person. The case went to trial in Tarrant County in August of 2019. The evidence against him was straightforward and decisive. The DNA recovered from the sexual assault exam matched his profile. There was no ambiguity in the science. Nyakio's defense offered an explanation for the DNA match that the jury ultimately rejected entirely. He claimed that someone had planted his DNA using material he had discarded, and that the DNA had been introduced into the victim's body without his involvement. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning a guilty verdict on both counts. In the punishment phase, where juries in Texas can weigh the full range of sentencing options, the jury sentenced Nyakio to 2 consecutive life sentences. He appealed the conviction. In 2020, the First Court of Appeals in Texas reviewed the case and affirmed both the conviction and the sentence. The victim in this case passed away from end-stage Alzheimer's disease later in 2018, at the age of 75, before the trial ever began. Her identity has been protected throughout all proceedings. She never had the chance to speak in a courtroom. But the investigation that was built around the evidence recovered after her injury gave her case a voice. The nursing staff who recognized that something was wrong and acted on it immediately, the medical professionals who conducted the examination, and the investigators who worked methodically through the evidence. Their actions are the reason accountability happened at all. Anthony Nyakio is currently serving 2 life sentences in the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. Case 6, Ernesto Pedraza. In a major medical center, patients move through the system quickly. They are admitted, treated, and discharged. Staff rotate between departments, between shifts, and sometimes between facilities. There is a rhythm to it, and within that rhythm, there is an expectation of safety. For at least 2 men in Houston between 2015 and 2016, that expectation was violated by someone who had access to them precisely because of his job. Ernesto Pedraza was a nurse care technician, a member of the direct patient care staff working at the bedside level. He worked at Ben Taub Hospital, part of the Harris Health System in central Houston, and later at Kingwood Medical Center, located in the northeastern part of the city. In both settings, his role gave him close, routine access to patients in vulnerable states, people who were unconscious or drifting in and out of awareness during procedures or in post-procedure recovery. The cases came forward when patients who had been in that condition during their hospital stays later reported to staff that they had been assaulted. They did not know each other. They had been treated at different facilities under different circumstances, but their accounts were consistent, and the details they described pointed to the same person. Both Bin Taub and Kingwood Medical Center conducted internal reviews after the reports were made. Both facilities terminated Pedraza and referred the matter to the Houston Police Department. Investigators spent time building a case that connected Pedraza's employment history at both facilities with the timeline of the reported incidents. Multiple victims came forward. Their willingness to describe what had happened to them, despite the deeply personal nature of the violations they experienced, was central to the prosecution's case. The Harris County District Attorney's Office filed charges. Pedraza was convicted by a Harris County jury on a felony count of sexual assault. At sentencing in August of 2019, the judge sentenced Ernesto Pedraza to 15 years in the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. The case drew public statements from then District Attorney Kim Ogg, who described it as a fundamental betrayal of the trust that patients place in hospital workers during their most vulnerable moments. Ogg noted that Pedraza had committed these acts repeatedly and that the victims, people who had come to a hospital in need of care, had deserved protection they did not receive. The case also raised a question that applies to institutions across the state. When a healthcare worker leaves one facility under investigation or after termination, what safeguards exist to prevent that person from moving to the next hospital and gaining access to a new set of patients? In Pedraza's case, the answer was not enough. Ernesto Pedraza is currently serving a 15-year sentence in the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. For the men who came forward and spoke with investigators, who described what had happened to them in a hospital where they had no reason to be afraid, their courage in doing so is what made this case possible. 6 cases, 6 investigations, 6 courtroom verdicts across more than 3 decades of documented history in the state of Texas. What connects every one of these cases is not just the setting and not just the profession of the person charged. What connects them is something quieter than that. In almost every case, the first person to notice that something was wrong was not a detective. It was not a state inspector. It was a coworker, a patient, a family member, someone who paid attention, trusted what they saw, and said something out loud. That is what started the investigations that built the cases that produced the verdicts. The people in these cases, the patients and families connected to each of these stories, did not have the luxury of knowing what was happening. They trusted the rooms they were in. They trusted the hands that were supposed to help them. Their stories deserve to be told carefully, factually, and with respect. That is what we try to do here at Quiet Room Cases. If this video was valuable to you, if you learned something, if you want to support more stories like this, please like this video, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. Every one of those actions helps this channel continue. We'll see you in the next case.